Welcome back to the Beehive, everybody. I hope you're doing well. We took a few weeks off of the Speedway, and now we're back. Today, we talk about one of the most underrated speedway riders of the 1970s. He was a good rider, but really underrated. He had no nickname. And who was he? He was number 7, Mark Cherry. Mark was born September 3rd, 1954, and he grew up in Playa del Rey. And that's over by Santa Monica, by the beach, Playa del Rey, where the boats are. It's really nice over there. And he was a young boy there. He got into mini bikes, the little mini cycles, and he was riding around, terrorizing. And then he met a guy who was another terrorist motorcycle rider at a young age. And his name is Mike Caruso. Mike Caruso, we had a blog on Mike Caruso just last show. And Mike Caruso and Mark Cherry were childhood friends. Mark Cherry and Mike Caruso. Mike and Mark, Mark and Mike, Mike and Mark, Mark and Mike. They were childhood friends. They were in the same class together in 3rd grade. They were just hanging out, and then they go motorcycle riding. They had a motorcycle companion, Mike and Mark. And they were 3rd grade classmates, and they were good friends. Like I mentioned, we did our last show on Mike Caruso, and he needs no introduction. Mike Caruso was a fabulous rider, just an amazing talent, Mike Caruso. And he grew up with Mark Cherry and Mike Caruso. Can you imagine those guys riding around the jumps? They were good riders. Mark Cherry started his speedway career in 1972. And by 1974, he had some injuries. But he started in 72 as a D3 and then a D2. And then by the 1974 season, he became a D1 rider. However, that 1974 season was fairly a disastrous season. Why? Because he had lots of injuries. About 5 months of the Speedway season, Mark Cherry was injured. He had a wrist injury, and then he had a collarbone injury, and then he was just farting around after his healing from those injuries. He went water skiing, and then he had a major knee injury to top it off. So Mark Cherry had a horrible 1974 Speedway season. Why? Because he was injured almost all the time. However, in the 75 Speedway season, Mark turned it around. He didn't injure himself like he did in the 74 season, and he put on some pretty good shows. I was watching Mark Cherry race at that time, and he surprised a few people sometimes. He was beating some of the top riders. He was a really good rider, Mark Cherry was. Very underrated. Nobody really expected him to win, but Mark Cherry would surprise people and he would win. Mark, he wore this cherry red uniform. His name was Cherry and he wore cherry. Go figure that one out. And he had this white letters for his sponsors on the front. And he was just a really good little rider. He was a little guy. He was like 5'5" and weighed probably 120 pounds, 110 pounds soaking wet. Mark Cherry was a little guy. And on the front of his uniform, he had white letters over his cherry red uniform. And it said Newport Dotson. And he was sponsored by Newport Dotson. I bet that's in Newport Beach, California. And he was sponsored by Van Land. Van Land! Do you know where Van Land is? I bet you don't know. I don't know. But anyways, it's somewhere on the earth. Van Land was Mark Cherry's sponsor. And of course, Newport Dotson. But is that still a bit... Do they still make Dotsons anymore? I am not sure if Sammy Tanner wore number 7 on his Speedway uniform. He probably did. However, Mark Cherry was probably the first or the second rider ever to wear number 77 on his uniform. Number 7! I'm number 7. Actually, if you add one more 7 to the 7, you got 77. Mark Cherry did all the general maintenance to his Speedway bike. We all did the general maintenance to our Speedway bikes, right? But we had an engine tuner. All of us had an engine tuner usually. And his engine tuner was the great Englishman, George Wynn. Do you know who George Wynn was? He was that guy who built that custom gold plate for Ivan Major's Speedway bike when he won his 3rd back-to-back-to-back World Championships. George Wynn told Ivan Major, if you win that third back-to-back-to-back world championship, I will take that Speedway bike and I will turn it to gold. Mark made his first and only United States Speedway National Championship in 1975, and it did not come easy. In the Jeff Sexton vlog I did a few weeks ago, I had mentioned that Jeff was in a three-way runoff for the final two spots in the United States Speedway Nationals in 75, and Jeff Sexton happened to win that runoff race. In second place was the famous Mark Cherry. He wasn't famous, but he made that show. So he got the second place, and that qualified him for the 16th spot in the United States Speedway National. And the loser of that three-way runner race was Steve Nutter. And we'll talk about Steve in a minute. The 75 Speedway National Championship was held at the amazing Los Angeles Coliseum in Los Angeles, California. It was perhaps one of the greatest United States Speedway National Championships in history. It was truly an amazing race. It was unbelievable, actually. And Mark Cherry was in that event. However, the winner of that national championship was none other than Mike Fast Fast. He won that championship. He won 7 out of 10 United States Speedway Championships in the 70s. That was Mark Cherry's first and perhaps only United States Speedway Championship. He might have been in more, but I don't know about that. And he didn't have a particularly good evening. Most people, when they ride their first United States Speedway Championships, don't do well unless your name's Jeff Sexton, then you almost win the national championship. But on the average, most people don't really fare too well. Bobby Schwartz was in that particular event, and he was down low. Bruce Penhall was there, and he had low points. And Mark Cherry only had like 3 or 4 points. My program said 4 points. So Mark Cherry had a particularly disappointing first and only United States Speedway Championship. He placed like 14th or 15th place out of 16. But hey, Mark Cherry made the United States Speedway National Championship. That was good. Congratulations, Mark Cherry. However, the second place winner was Dangerous Doug Farrell.
Woo! Woo! Woo!
And the third place finisher was an amazing finish. It's like the first time I ever seen a reserve. Remember that reserve that got third place in that qualifier? Well, he went ahead and got a podium spot in that national championship. That was Steve Nutter. Steve Nutter was a reserve. And then Mike Caruso was on the program that particular event. And he was a no-show. I don't know what happened to Mike Caruso. However, Steve Nutter was first reserve. He took his rides, all of his rides, Mike Caruso's, and guess what? Steve Nutter was on the podium with 12 points. Woo-hoo! They had a United States Speedway qualifiers, and in the last qualifying event, Mark Cherry got 10 out of 12 points. He beat the amazing Dangerous Doug Farrell and Steve Bass. He won those guys to qualify to get into the national championship, and that's that event that he had that runoff. The three-way runoff was Sexy Jeff Sexton. I had just mentioned that. Sorry, it was a little out of order. But Sexy Jeff Sexton went ahead and won. He prayed. He said, God help me. I want to win this race. 2 out of the 3 riders made that 75 national championship, and Sexy Jeff Sexton won that race, followed by Mark Cherry. That's all you want to do is first or second so you can be on the program. And Mark Cherry was second place. He was on that program. And Steve Nutter was a disappointing third. However, like I mentioned, Mike Caruso didn't show. Steve Nutter took his place. He rode all of his races, and he got 12 points. I think it was tied with Doug Farrell, I'm not sure. And then he, I think maybe lost in the runoff. He got third place on the podium. And that's the first time you're ever going to see a reserve rider go all the way to the podium in third place. That's totally unbelievable. They asked Mark Cherry, how did you do it? How did you get on that national championship program? And he said that I gave it all I had. I raced as if there's no tomorrow. And Mark Cherry, he made that United States Speedway Championship because he really gave it all he had. And he got in that championship event. The following year in '76, Mark Cherry went over to England and he was racing in Birmingham. However, he wasn't on the team particularly. He was racing in these match races, these particular races, and he was over there in the '76 season. And I believe that was the last season for Mark Cherry. He probably came home and he had got married. He married a beautiful lady, and her brother was a famous rider. I don't know if you ever heard of him. His name is Bruce the Fox Penhall. And Bruce Penhall had a sister, an older sister. I think she was older sister, maybe younger, who knows. But Mark Cherry met Bruce Penhall's sister and they got married. And to this day, Mark Cherry and Bruce Penhall's sister are still husband and wife. Mark Cherry had an amazing 6-year run at Racing Speedway, and then he retired. And then about 1985, Harry Oxley went ahead and got Mark Cherry and all the legends of Speedway, Rick Woods, Danny Becker, all these guys, Mike Bass, there's a whole bunch of guys, and they did a race. It was for charity. Chalk Hospital in Orange, California, and they went ahead and had a special night of racing with all the old timers. That would have been fun to watch, and all the riders were a little bit out of shape, and they probably felt like they never rode a speedway bike before, although they did not forget how to ride a speedway bike. And they had a special match race. They had Rick the Rocket Woods versus Danny Bazooka Becker. Also in 2019, they had a special Legends Speedway night at the Industry Hills in Industry, California, at the Grand. And guess who was there? There was all the Speedway legends, all the guys were there. And Mark Cherry was there too. Mark Cherry, one of the least known big name riders in the 1970s. He just was an unassuming little guy. He didn't have a nickname. He didn't have particularly a nice uniform. Cherry red for Cherry. Wasn't that exciting? And he was a little guy. He was 5'5", and he was just a little tiny guy. But Mark Cherry was a good rider. I saw him win several of these races, and he was good. So Mark Cherry was an outstanding Speedway rider. He rode for 6 years Speedway, and he just did a lot for Speedway. He was there competing with all the top riders. He was good. And who was that? Number 7, Mark Cherry.